My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
The need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Ongoing Russian aggression toward Ukraine has dominated news reporting in the early weeks of 2022, once again putting Europe at the top of the headlines and threatening the largest military confrontation on the continent since World War II. In many ways, Europe has also been at the top of the to-do list for the Biden administration in its first year, as it seeks to rebuild and enhance alliances and relationships that had floundered during the previous administration, as part of its overall framing of today's geostrategic landscape as one defined by a contest between democracy and authoritarianism. How has the Biden administration gone about this effort? In the face of daunting policy challenges such as the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the potential for war in Ukraine, and some own goals in Afghanistan and in regard to the September 2021 US-UK-Australia submarine deal, how has the administration fared thus far? What are we missing beyond the headlines? Why are relationships so important? ISD Distinguished Resident Fellow and retired U.S. Ambassador John Heffern joined us on the show to talk about Europe and American policies toward the continent, what has gone well, and what he's looking for moving forward. Ambassador Heffern joined ISD in 2017, and his current focus at Georgetown is diplomacy and social entrepreneurship, including work to connect U.S.-based organizations and their fellows with partners overseas in the governmental and non-governmental sectors. Prior to coming to Georgetown, Heffern served as Acting Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs. Previously, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Armenia from 2011 to 2014, Deputy Chief of Mission at U.S. NATO in Brussels, Belgium, Deputy Chief of Mission in Jakarta, Indonesia, and Executive Assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Let's have a listen. Welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. On today's episode, we're talking with ISD Fellow and former FSO and former Ambassador John Heffern. Welcome to the show, John.
Kelly, thank you very much.
So you spent the bulk of your career dealing with issues related to Europe, and that's what we're going to chat about today as part of our look at the Biden administration at 1 year and what to watch for and look for moving forward. And obviously right now, if you pay any attention to the news whatsoever, Ukraine and potential Russian aggression is all over the news. You know, with everybody focused on this Ukraine-Russian issue in Europe right now, what do you see as other issues that we might not be looking at going on in Europe that we should be focusing on? And, you know, how should the U.S. work to prioritize those sorts of things when you have 100,000 Russian troops on the border with Ukraine?
Well, Kelly, thanks much for this opportunity. I do need to sort of start at the beginning a little bit. I'll try not to drone on too long, but I want to start at the beginning a little bit with sort of our three pillars of our relationship with Europe, and then jump right into the question. Obviously, the transatlantic relationship is critically important to all of us, to the world, I have to say. And our three pillars are, our first, of course, is always the mission statement. Secretary Powell taught us, focus on the mission. What is the mission of what we're trying to do before we start worrying about policy and jobs and decisions and stuff? And our mission statement for Europe is pretty simple and pretty clear. We want to promote a Europe that's whole, free, and at peace. And that's why the Ukraine crisis crosses all those red lines. So the mission statement is first. The second is that with Europe, we are trying to build institutions, democratic institutions, security architecture, both transatlantic but also international. And those institutions are helping countries all over the world deal with crises as they come along. And the third, of course, is that Europe is our partner of first resort. We work with the Europeans on everything, on security, on humanitarian, on democracy, in the UN, with the EU, NATO, everything we do, Europe is part of in some way. So those three pillars are really key. And again, that's why the Ukraine-Russia crisis is such a major focus. It's beyond, Ukraine is important. The people of Ukraine are very important. but it goes beyond Ukraine. It affects our architecture and relationships far beyond the current crisis. So what are other things that are out there? There's a lot of other stuff going on, of course, and the fallout from Afghanistan is still there. We have German elections that were very important, and we've got to work with the new German government. Problems with democratic backsliding. Poland's made a couple of favorable steps recently, surprisingly and helpfully, but Hungary is still a serious problem. So when one of our allies and EU member countries has democratic backsliding like that, that's a serious problem, and we need to spend some time and attention on that. Balkans is always an issue, and Bosnia is heating up again. There could be, God forbid, some kind of ethnic outbreaks of some sort in Bosnia as well. So Bosnia is always a problem and is heating up again. And finally, I would say Turkey is always a priority. Turkey is strategically located, big, complicated, got issues with democracy and all sorts of internal issues, but a critical ally and partner for everything that we do. So there's a lot out there beyond the Ukraine crisis. But it really is, it is understandable that the Ukraine crisis is sucking up all the oxygen because what the Russians are doing crosses all the red lines that we've discussed.
Yeah, and you mentioned the democracy issue and the democracy backsliding. And as you well know, a huge, if not the largest part of the Biden administration's strategy so far has been this democracy versus authoritarianism formulation in geopolitics and in world politics, and sort of the basis of their national security strategy, at least so far. And we've seen, obviously the European partners are biggest and the first ones we're going to go to as far as sort of getting democracies together and to push back against authoritarianism. And that's been a big part of that. And we've also seen the Biden administration come in and talk a lot on the campaign trail and then early on about reforming these relationships, getting back to this alliance system and our partners in Europe. And there's been a lot of rhetoric around that, and they have been moving forward on certain things. But then we've also stumbled a little bit with our dealing on how we got out of Afghanistan and, whether or not we left some European allies and NATO in the lurch a little bit. And then also with the AUKUS deal with the French submarines in Australia and all that stuff. So, 1 year in at this point, how has the Biden administration been approaching Europe? How do you think they've done? Because there has been that rhetoric, but then there's been some back steps. And also, what are you looking for in the next year and beyond in the administration as far as their focus on Europe, beyond obviously the Ukraine-Russia issue, which you stated, and correctly, that is a huge issue and affects all of Europe.
Kelly, I mean, this team is a first-class team, and one of the things that the president has done so well, I think, is assembling a team of real, serious, smart, well-connected people with good judgment and good policy sense. So I think the Europe-based team is first class. But also the whole global team on the foreign policy side, I think, is first class. So I think he certainly gets high marks for that. I do think that Afghanistan, while certainly the desire to get out was widespread, and I shared, it's just hard to say they've done a fantastic job with the horrors of what ensued after that hasty withdrawal. So there must have been a better way to do it. I can't suggest what that could have been, so I hate to criticize it because I don't have a better alternative. But that was a serious black mark. I think they've done well in terms of countering the 4 bad Trump years in just trying to rebuild the relationships and restitch together these various institutions, and that's been their focus. And that's frankly why they made a big mistake. To me, their biggest mistake on Europe was not the AUKUS thing. I think that's a blip. Is Nord Stream 2. The fact that they didn't follow through on the sanctions in Nord Stream 2 because they were so desperate to rebuild our relationship with Germany after the horrors of the Trump years, I think was a serious mistake. I think we could and should have done the necessary on Nord Stream 2 and still been able to rebuild our relationship with Germany. So that I would say was their biggest Europe-related mistake. So I'd say first class on the people, strong marks on the basics, on relationship building and all the fundamental parts of diplomacy, good policy judgment across the board on all the key issues, but a serious blunder with Afghanistan, obviously a horrible blunder with Afghanistan, And the specific Europe mistake to me that was the worst was the Nord Stream 2 decision not to sanction the companies involved.
So I want to hit you with a quick follow-up on the moving forward aspect. And the Nord Stream 2 issue is obviously a huge bilateral issue with the Germans, but also speaks to broader differences of opinion on things within the EU, within NATO, within the US and Europe writ large. You're a former diplomat. You've been in these rooms talking to European counterparts and everything. What do you think the discussions are going to be like going forward as the team that you talked about is trying to corral the Europeans together to create a situation where they can face Russia without militarily going into Ukraine, and really trying to put something together when not everybody necessarily agrees on how to do that? How does that diplomacy play out on the ground?
I mean, it's critically important to have those relationships so you can do that, because you're right. We are not all of like mind on Russia. I do think countries that have been cautious in the past, especially Germany, I think will come along, and I think will join really serious sanctions, including cutting Nord Stream 2, maybe kicking Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. Some of the big ideas that have been talked about. I think Germany, in the end, will go along. To me, countries like Hungary are the bigger problem because they have a weird sort of attachment to Putin and Russia and authoritarianism, which is difficult. But I do think, in the end, I doubt if the Hungarians can block consensus on issues like that. So I do think that we will come forward with some actions before Russia does something really bad, or especially after something really bad happens. I think we will take strong action in three areas: sanctions, reinforcing our forces in NATO countries around Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, and especially providing the Ukrainians continue. This has already started, and I commend the Biden administration for this, providing the Ukrainians with lots of good, important defensive weapons, even importantly, lethal weapons, to help them defend themselves, which is obviously the key. So I'd say strong marks, but a couple of blips.
Yeah, it's going to be definitely the most tense time period in European relations in a long time, at least a generation, if not longer. So will be interesting to see how things play out in the next few weeks and months. So you teach a course on NATO at Georgetown. You've done simulations and taught things at the War College. So you mentioned a blip, but some positive moves forward. So what are we talking here from Professor Heffern? Is this like a B minus so far? What would you say?
I just think that the fundamentals are getting back on track, and the people are so strong, and the relationships are being rebuilt. So I'd hate to go too low, but the blips were pretty bad. So I would say a B plus would be sort of my grade for this first year. But I do expect better things to come. I do think that as this team gets our allies together, they're going to be rebuilding consensus on some of these tough decisions, and I do think dealing with Russia, but even in on all the other issues that we've discussed, this team and this alliance are building back better, and I think that's really important. Let me just mention one last thing before we cut off, because I think it's really important again in terms of this Russia, the relationship with Russia. In the late 90s, when we began our enlargement, when NATO began the enlargement process in a serious way, we had what we thought was a strategic partnership with Russia. And with this NATO-Russia Founding Act, we made two very major commitments to Russia: not to put nuclear weapons in any of these new NATO countries in the East, and also not to station substantial combat forces in any of these countries. So two major concessions: no nukes and no major combat forces in these new allied countries along the East. We made that commitment in 1997, and we actually are still honoring that commitment despite what Russia has done recently. So this idea that Russia is afraid of NATO enlargement and all is not so. They're afraid of Western ideas and Western ideals. They're not afraid of NATO enlargement. They're not afraid of NATO countries on their border. They're afraid that our ideals and our ideas will infect them and their people. And I do think the not concessions, but the arrangements that we made with Russia in the late 90s are still valid. And the Biden administration gets strong marks for not caving into any of these other new Russian demands, which are clearly going nowhere. Dialogue is key: deterrence, defense, and dialogue, the 3 Ds. Dialogue is key, and I strongly support it. But I do think that we have already done with Russia, made arrangements which meet their security concerns. So I think we have a strong case for dialogue in the future, but also we've got to get the defense and deterrence right.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely key point, is the fact that to remember that NATO is not just a military alliance, it's also a political alliance. And I think that
absolutely,
at the end of the day, is what the Russians fear the most, is the encroachment of those political ideals closer to their borders, not necessarily, the military is the boogeyman that they're using as an excuse to do what they're doing to try to push back against democratization along their borders. And I think that's a key point to remember. But all right, John, as always, it was good talking to you, and I appreciate you coming on Diplomatic Immunity today.
My pleasure, Kelly. Thanks, Kelly.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening to this episode. Please share the episode on social media and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us wherever they listen to podcasts. This episode was produced by Alistair Somerville. Audio editing for this episode was done by Aaron Jones. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. Until we meet again.